Good morning. We are on location in Prince George with Alyssa Leier, Executive Director of the Exploration Place in Prince George. Alyssa,
hi.
welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is very exciting. My first
Yeah.
time doing a live stream podcast, so this is cool.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great. Mine too,
Oh,
actually.
perfect. We're learning together. That's great.
Yeah. So Alyssa's the Executive Director of the Exploration Place. It's a place that I'm really familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
I've brought my kids there since they were little. We've probably run into each other a few times.
Definitely.
If you've been there 13 years, you said?
Yeah, I've been at the Exploration Place for just about 13 years. I actually started there as a summer student back in 2012, 2013. I was a garden interpreter to begin with, and I've sort of moved through the ranks, going into the curatorial department and then the curator and now the executive director. So lots of personal evolvement, I suppose. And no, it's very exciting to be with an organization that long and see it grow the way it has.
Yeah. So a garden curator.
Yeah.
That's a new word.
Yeah, I actually came there as a summer student. So when I first started, it was a garden interpreter position. So we had an outside urban garden that we were growing fruits and veggies and supplying kids in our summer camps with. And then kids would come out there from the summer camp and learn how to grow food and where food comes from and just food science, which I think is really important for kids just to know, where does food come from? You don't just buy it at a grocery store. So that's where I started at the Exploration Place. We had bees at the time, and there's sort of this running joke that I was out there taking care of bees and fruits and veggies at the beginning, and yeah, it's just evolved from there.
Oh, that's really neat. Now, if you're in charge of kind of garden stuff, does that have anything to do with the plants as well, like trees and shrubs and bushes? And
yeah, we had all sorts of stuff out there. Hopefully we're going to be doing the urban garden again this year. I'm not sure what the programming is going to look like at this point. We're seeking funding for summer students, and like I said, that's how I started at the Exploration Place, was a summer student out there. So we're hopeful that that's going to continue and that we can grow a surplus of herbs and veggies and fruits, and maybe even use that in our Origins teaching kitchen, which would be super cool. Get the kids involved out there as well.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
That kitchen is amazing.
It's very cool. It's perfect. It sets up for lots of teaching and programming with kids. And again, food science and kids understanding, where does my food come from? How is my food made? Because there's actually a lot of chemistry and stuff that takes place when you're cooking the food as well. So there's lots of interesting things for kids to learn, and we can tie in the urban garden as well. So that's a huge win for us.
Okay. So I'm just going to guess. I'm going to go out on a limb and say you had something to do with the living wall there.
You know what? I love plants and I love the outdoors, but I wasn't directly involved in that. Chad Hellenius, who's our assistant curator, his background is botany. Mine is archaeology, so I love plants, but it's not botany. So I'm really good at houseplants at home, but to plan that massive living wall, that was definitely a feat, and I'm so impressed. John Caligeris was our facilities manager at the time as well. So they built that from the ground up and planted all of those beautiful plants that you see in there. And obviously it's doing really well, and it's beautiful, and it's lush, and it's green, and it's the perfect environment to come in and have a cup of coffee, because you get to almost be outside in the winter, which is beautiful in Prince George.
Yeah. I was there, I think, about 2 weeks before you opened.
Yeah.
When you had the wall up, I think there was still some drywall being done and dinosaurs were being moved around.
You got to see
inside.
the chaos behind the scenes.
I definitely did.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that wall was up, and there were these little critters swimming around in the water.
Yes.
And they were so cool looking. I took a picture of them. I'm like, my kids have never seen anything like this. They're going to be blown away. And as soon as I showed it to them, they're like, oh, that's
They knew immediately. An axolotl. I bet it's the axolotl. So
Yeah.
my parents joke around, because I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. And one of my 2-year-old's first words was axolotl. And my parents are like, you have a museum science center kid when one of their first words is axolotl, and they know what an axolotl is. But it's actually amazing, because kids come in and they immediately recognize them. I guess they're part of the Minecraft game, which I'm not super familiar with, but that's what I hear every time when new kids come in. Oh my God, it's an axolotl from Minecraft. So kids love them, and they're really cool and important to that system as well. It's a closed system. So there's aquariums at the base, and the axolotls and the fish are in the aquariums, and they're pooping. And the plants are above and worked into that system. So the poop is actually acting as fertilizer for the plants. So it's going through the tubing in that system. It's feeding the plants. The plants are cleaning it out of the water, and clean fresh water is coming out the bottom. So they're actually working cohesively as one unit and benefiting one another. So it's very cool.
No kidding.
Yeah, and when I talk about the planning that went went into that living wall, that's exactly what I mean. It's very impressive that John and Chad were able to build a system like that where they're benefiting one another and both are thriving. Those plants started as little clippings, and now they're lush and green and filling the entire space. So it's super cool. And we have the axolotls to thank for that.
Okay, so here's a topic I was most excited to talk about.
Yeah.
Archaeology. You're an actual archaeologist, like an actual one.
I studied archaeology at Simon Fraser University. I first started in Kamloops, and then I moved to the Vancouver campus to finish my degree. So my graduate degree is in archaeology and First Nations studies. After I completed that, I went and did a little bit of internship work at the Nanaimo Museum. And then I came to Prince George, and I tried really hard to get into Exploration Place because I thought the work that they were doing was amazing. So I started at Exploration Place, and then I was still wanting to get out in the field and do actual hands-on archaeology, not just lab work like I do at the Exploration Place sometimes, but actually the digging and the studying in the field. So I worked for a company called Archer CRM for a number of years, and I was lucky because we know Prince George has intense winters. So in the field season, I'd go out and I'd be working with Archer, and I'd be digging and doing lots of fun things out in the field. And then in the winter time, I got to come back into the museum and enjoy the warmth of, the curatorial vault and the lab work that we do at the Exploration Place. So it's been really cool. When I took over the curator position, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go out in the field as much. And it's been a couple of years since I've been able to, but I always love it because it's different. You get to be out in nature and you never know what you're going to find. So it's definitely fascinating work that you can tie into my work at the Exploration Place as well.
Okay. Take me through a day, like what somebody can expect. Because like
The average day.
Yeah, because like when I was a kid, that was kind of like a dream to be an archaeologist. Like for most kids, I think, because you'd be digging in the sand all the time. You'd be pulling up rocks and bones and like who knows what, right?
Yeah, so I always wanted to be an archaeologist. Just like you as a kid, that's what I always said I wanted to be, and my parents supported that. And so when I found out you could actually do an archaeology degree at Simon Fraser University, that I knew that's the school I wanted to go to, because there's not a lot of schools you can actually get a degree in archaeology. A lot of them are anthropology. So UMBC, your degree is in anthropology, which archaeology is a sub-branch of anthropology, but I really wanted it to be an archaeology degree. And a lot of the work that happens in British Columbia is called cultural resource management. So you're working with the resource sector, and you're going into the areas where there's going to be industry working, and you're making sure that there's not going to be disturbing of archaeological sites, because archaeological sites are protected in British Columbia. So that is the average work that I was doing. So a lot of it is shift work. So you'd be 10 and 4 is what my usual shift was when I was doing cultural resource management with our archaeology firm. So for 10 days, you're kind of going into the middle of nowhere and doing archaeology. A lot of it is forestry. So you're looking at proposed cut blocks, and you're walking those cut blocks and just making sure that they're not going to be disturbing archaeological sites. Which is really fascinating and really interesting. It's nice to be in the middle of nowhere and see, nature and where people may have been. So archaeology is the study of humans. And a lot of people get paleontology and archaeology sort of mixed up, which paleontology is animals and dinosaurs. Dinosaurs is what people think of when they think of paleontology, whereas archaeology, we're studying people. So in British Columbia, it's Indigenous history that you're really looking at.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought archaeology was always was digging stuff up. Like
you are
artifacts.
not the only one. So yeah, paleontology, dinosaur bones, archaeology, Indigenous history in British Columbia, essentially. So looking for projectile points or pit houses or cache pits, basically evidence of where Indigenous peoples were living and hunting and camping in the past.
Okay. So would like cave paintings and stuff fall under that?
Yeah, pictographs and pectoglyphs, that we do find those in British Columbia, a little bit more rare, but absolutely. And I was lucky enough to see some of that while I was working in cultural resource management as well.
Were you ever involved in like, what do you do? Like scout out a location before they plan to develop it, and then where you've actually found stuff?
Yeah, so a lot of it is empty holes. You're doing shovel test pits, and More often than not, you're coming up with nothing. But the odd time, you're lucky enough to find something. And I was lucky enough to find some stone tools. When I did my undergrad, we had to do a hands-on field school. And so in my field school, I was excavating a pit house. So it's funny because when you're doing your field school, you're finding a lot of cool stuff because you're working on a site, you're working on a site, and typically you're going to be finding things all day long. But when you're actually out in the field doing cultural resource management, you quickly find that you don't find as much as you did in field school, and it's not quite as exciting in that way. But when you do find something, it is very exciting and very cool because if you find something and you pull it out, you know that it hasn't been held for thousands of years, and it's kind of a neat feeling to hold a stone tool that you know someone made 1,000 years ago and hasn't touched since then, and you're a human holding something that was made essentially 1,000 years ago or more, or maybe a little bit less, but it's interesting and it's a neat feeling. It's hard to describe.
Wow, that must be cool. Like, what are some of the neatest things you've actually found? Like, as far as tools go, I picture arrowheads.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. So projectile points, like an arrowhead or pieces, a lot of the time they're broken. So that's why they're left behind. Maybe they were used for hunting, or maybe someone was sitting there making it and they broke it as they were making it and they kind of throw it away. A lot of the time what you're finding is lithic debitage, and that's the pieces that have come off of a stone while they're making a projectile point or an arrowhead. So that's definitely the most common thing that you're finding is the debitage from when they were making those tools. It's not quite as common to find this full, beautiful point that we all hope that we would, dig out of the hole. But when you do, it is very exciting.
So what happens if you're on a cut block and you find that? They must hate that, right? They don't want that to happen, right?
Yeah. So then, of course, your job as an archaeologist is to protect that. So you want to make sure that you delineate the site and find the full extent of where the site is and mark those boundaries and make sure that it's protected from development and that it's not going to be impacted.
I want to talk about the tools again because I picture like all the caveman videos and they've got that hammer in their hand, but it would have like a wood handle and it would be tied maybe a stone with sinew or something?
Yeah, it totally depends on the tool. If you come to the exploration place and you go into Hodelea, which is a place, a learning gallery that's in partnership with Claytley Tenay, there was one site that was excavated in Prince George by a local firm and the Claytley Tenay, and it's very impressive. So 2% of the site has been excavated, and there's 33,000 objects that have come from 22% of the site. And some of these tools date back to 10,000 years. And so it really depends what tools you're looking at. The projectile points, yeah, you're right, absolutely. They would have probably been on, depending on what type of projectile point they are. If they were an arrowhead, then they're going to have the wooden shaft that they would have been tied to. But then there's choppers and cutters that are huge. They're the size of an axe head that you'd just be using your hand for. Mortar and pestle, same thing. You'd just be using your hands for that. So it really depends on the type of tool that you're talking about, and there's a vast amount of them. It's really interesting, and specifically that site there, the vast array of tools that are coming out of there because of continuous occupation of 10,000 years is really neat to look at.
Wow. So 10,000 years, like how can a wooden handle be preserved that long, or anything that kind of like is not stone, I guess?
Well, that's exactly it, right? A lot of the time it doesn't last. And so archaeologists are able to do carbon testing on sort of the ground and the contents of the ground surrounding those stone tools. And that's why provenance is so important. And that's why provincial law, prohibits people from removing those objects out of situ, because it's really important that we're actually able to look at where those objects are located to accurately date them and get information about them. Once we remove them from there, you can't date stone. So we really don't know how old they are. But if you leave it in place and it's properly excavated and removed, then archaeologists can remove some of the soil or some of the organic material that's located with it and accurately test that through carbon dating.
Could it be older than that, or are they sure it's?
Well, it's hard to say. Only 2% of the site's been excavated. So if you think about what's in the other 98%, it's really hard to say. There could be a lot more history there just waiting to be, learned, and it could change the course of our history in northern British Columbia as well. It could tell us something totally different that we don't know now. But right now that site is preserved, which is very important.
Yeah. Is it probably not open to the public or anything like that, right? It's protected, blocked off area.
It's not blocked off, actually. In British Columbia, sites are protected, so they're not typically mapped out for the public to know that they're there, just because, you know, you worry about people going and doing their own excavations and disturbing the site. So what I will say is it's close to the Simon Fraser Bridge in town here, and it is walkable.
That close?
Yeah, it's right in the middle of town here. And in fact, there's over 100 recorded sites in Prince George.
No kidding.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting once you know where the sites are located and what the history of Prince George is and how long Clayton Tenay has been here, because there are, like I said, over 100 documented sites in Prince George. It's really, really cool.
Is that little home area up in Forest for the World, is that one of the documented sites?
You know, I actually don't know. Anytime you have a water feature like a lake, you can almost guarantee that there's sites surrounding it. Mm-hmm. I don't know off the top of my head if there's a recorded site there, but I can guarantee with 100% certainty that there definitely is a site somewhere in there.
Okay. Yeah.
That is where they did one of the pit house reconstructions close to Forest for the World, and there likely were real pit houses around that area. I don't know that there's been excavation work done to know, but anytime there's a water feature, if we want to camp there, people wanted to camp there in the past.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
So I bet you walk along the river, and of those 100 sites in Prince George, probably 75 of them are along the river or nearby.
Oh, absolutely. Right? And for me, it's hard. I go out on hikes, especially around the river, around lakes, and you should be looking all around you and taking in the sights, and I can't help but just constantly look at the ground. It's funny because when I go out with my husband and my kids, he's like, stop looking at the ground, because then all of us get in that mode where we're just looking down, waiting to, find something. Because, when you're walking around Prince George, because it's continuous occupation for 10,000 years, and you're on these water features, on these nice, beautiful terraces, like the exploration place, you just know people have been here and we're working there as well.
Yeah, that's so neat. Like, you wouldn't really have imagined that. Like looking around, I guess, been to Europe, been on holidays where you see, like, the Colosseum, you see these old cobblestone streets and walls, and that's kind of what I expect anyway, is when I think of settlements and stuff. But are there any places like that in BC that you can actually find like walls that were constructed and
Yeah, it's a little bit different, and of course textbooks teach us all about colonial history, so that's what we have in our head. So when we think of Europe, we think, oh my gosh, they have this vast history that goes back, thousands of years, but we don't think about the history in our own backyard. And British Columbia has history that's gone back thousands of years when it comes to people. It just looks different than what we think it should look like, because we picture this colonial history of these beautiful brick buildings. But in fact, Indigenous people have been here for thousands of years, and they've been building structures as well. There's an archaeological site in southern British Columbia. It's called Keatley Creek, and there's over 10,000 pit house depressions. So 10,000 homes. It was a city thousands of years ago located in southern British Columbia, and that site's really cool when you go and visit it. And if you look at a picture, it looks like a moonscape. It's just depression after depression after depression. So there's definite evidence of buildings and cities as well, not just small settlements like we think of around Prince George, but Keatley Creek, check it out. It's really, really interesting.
10,000. I can't even imagine that, because that's like downtown, like Prince George, the whole bowl area.
That's a lot of depressions. It blew my mind when I actually visited the site. Like I said, it looked like you were on the moon, just riddled with these giant depressions.
Wow.
Very interesting.
So do you know what those houses must have looked like at the time? The pit houses?
Yeah, and in southern British Columbia, there's a few places where they're reconstructed. Where I went to school for the first couple years of my undergraduate degree in Kamloops, the pit house village there, which is close to the Kamloops residential school, they have a lot of those pit houses reconstructed. So as field schools were happening, they were reconstructing the pit houses afterwards. So those are real traditional pit houses that you can walk into. Right now, the museum's open, I believe, starting this spring, and you can go walk into those pit houses and then walk into the museum and see some of the materials that's been collected from them. So that's really interesting to see. There are a few places in British Columbia where they are reconstructed on original pit houses that you can actually check out and see this is what life was like at this time.
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
So pit houses are what are common around here.
Yes, definitely in
area,
northern
yeah.
British Columbia, around Prince George, pit houses would have been the traditional winter dwelling. It varies in different communities. I know when you get closer to the coast, there's long houses or different styles of rectangular winter dwellings, but in Prince George and area, it would have been the traditional pit houses underground.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit more about objects being found and stuff. What's like one of the coolest things that you found? Yourself.
That I have found.
Yeah.
I was working a little bit closer to Terrace. Usually when I was working for the archaeology firm, I was around Prince George and Fort St. James most often. But I was lucky enough to do a couple runs closer to Terrace and working with some communities there. And it seemed like I was in the middle of nowhere. And the field supervisor at the time thought that a location we were walking through looked like it could have been used, like there could have been an archaeological site there. So we started doing those shovel test pits, and a perfect projectile point came out of the ground, and it was like the size of my palm, and everyone was so excited. And it was actually the First Nation participant at the time that reached in and grabbed it, and it was such a cool moment, and probably the best moment I've had working in archaeology, because he was overcome by emotion knowing that his ancestors made this object and they hadn't held it in, possibly a couple thousand years, and he was the first one to hold it since his ancestor had made it, and sort of reclaiming this area that industry might take over as, having this history. And so that was really cool, because it was like perfectly preserved, wasn't broken, looked absolutely like it was made yesterday, and just we all honestly jumped up and down in excitement and were overcome by emotion. It was just a really neat moment. So that's probably the coolest thing I have found personally. Depending on who you talk to, they might find it less exciting or more exciting. But for me, that was the highlight moment.
That sounds like something pretty exciting. I would love to see some of those.
You got to come see me at the exploration place.
Yeah,
at least
okay.
We can show you some of the items that have come out of Prince George, out of that Simon Fraser Bridge site that I'm talking about. Like I said, 33,000 objects from that site alone, and 2% of the site. So there is a lot of stone tools that have come out of there.
Wow. And even so, like if you're talking, 500 pieces, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody was sitting there and they were making that arrowhead.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you come across what we call the lithic debitage, or those flakes, and then all of a sudden you find what they were working on, like they've messed up and they've thrown it. You can just get into their emotions, I can't even begin to understand if that's your livelihood and you've been working on it for that many hours, and all of a sudden you make a mistake and the tip shatters off and you have to throw it and start from scratch again. You do find instances like that.
Oh.
And if you've ever tried flint knapping before, which I have tried to get into it and learn it a little bit, it's incredibly difficult. It looks like maybe it wouldn't be that hard, but it's incredibly difficult. And more often than not, you break a piece off and you have to start from scratch.
Well, I've cut stuff out of wood, and I know what that's like. So,
yeah.
I couldn't imagine stone. It would be so much more delicate, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And just getting your hands on those resources would have been more difficult. It's not like you can pick up any stone off the ground and make something out of that. It takes a very specialized and strong type of stone that you can actually do that lithic flaking from. So resources would have been very important. Trade would have been very important, and just knowing where you could get access to those types of stones.
Oh, I'll bet. I never even thought of that. Yeah.
Obsidian specifically. So obsidian's that glassy black stone that you see some tools made out of. Mm-hmm. There's some really great sources of obsidian in northeastern British Columbia. There's a quarry, I think, outside of Quesnel and Nasco territory.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, and what's really cool about obsidian specifically is you can actually scientifically look at what that obsidian is made out of, and sort of what makes it differ from other obsidian, and know exactly in the province where it came from, or across North America. And there's instances, just because their chemical composition is slightly different depending on the source, where you can actually map out trade networks to see where that obsidian's coming from. Oh, wow. Which is really cool. But again, it's really important to know where that object came from when we're talking about provenance, and not removing objects from a site, because once you remove that, we can't really map it out. But if we know exactly where that came from, and then we look at the chemical composition, we can map out how far of a distance that obsidian had to travel to be made into a tool and used. So it's cool.
And that's really interesting, because I know, like, I read a lot about, the pyramids in Egypt, and and they drag stone like 500 miles to build the pyramids, and then they bring limestone from another quarry that's miles and miles away. And so people were doing the same sort
thing
of thing
happening
here.
here across really well-known and well-used trade networks. There's an item that's on display at the exploration place right now. We have an exhibit with the Mayu KO. And there's a headdress on display there.
Seen it?
Yeah, from the Royal Ontario Museum. We're having it repatriated back to the Indigenous community. And as we're working on this, we're looking at making a replica of this headdress. So we're looking in detail, what is this headdress made out of? And part of it is dentalium, but also whale baleen. And so if you're looking at a community outside Fort St. James, obviously there's no whales around there, right? So you know that there must have been incredible resource wealth in the KO that they were actually able to trade for something like whale baleen. And to get that in Fort St. James at the time, there would have been a really good trade network there. So it's pretty cool to look at, just the trade of these resources amongst the province. And whale baleen and dentalium shells in Fort St. James. Very cool.
Okay, so let's talk about that whale baleen, because I don't know what that is, and the people listening most likely don't either, right?
And I wasn't super familiar with it either, because it's not something we commonly see here. And in fact, we were a little bit stumped when we first saw the headdress, and we couldn't figure out what was on top of the headdress or possibly woven into the hair that was giving it the strength. So if you look into whale baleen, so the part that I think of when I think of whale baleen now is those types of whales that you kind of suck in the krill and you see that filter system. Whale baleen. So it's interesting. You can actually separate that baleen, and it comes out in a texture sort of like human hair, except more plasticky and more durable and has more strength. So if you look in the history books, there's actually a lot of items that were made out of baleen, like corsets, for example, because it has incredible strength and it's a lot like plastic. And of course, it was pre-plastic time periods. So whale baleen was being used in things like corsets. And so it makes sense once you recognize the whale baleen in this headdress that it would be used for this. And at the time when we first looked at it, when it came here from the Royal Ontario Museum with the Mayu KO and the family, we thought, it almost looks like some of the strands of hair have something like hairspray on them. Of course, we knew it wasn't hairspray, but giving them that little bit more shine and that strength. And only now looking at it, are we thinking, actually, it's probably little tiny strands of whale baleen woven into the braids through the hair that's giving it this extra strength.
One of the things that I find is really amazing is you're talking about what it would take to create a replica of it. And it sounds like, kind of like with the pyramids, like you have no idea. Like you'd have to source materials from all over, the province, maybe further, right? And then find a way to work it. It
really talks about the incredible knowledge that these, in this case, the Mayu KO and the community had, because we actually had to partner the Mayu KO, the exploration place, and BD Biodiversity Museum out of the Museum of Anthropology into working together for them to come with their staff scientists and identify some of the things that were in this headdress, like the whale baleen. Because personally, I wouldn't have recognized that. I'm not familiar with whale baleen. I haven't seen it woven into something like that. And when they came up as professionals, they quickly identified it as whale baleen. And so the incredible knowledge that the community had that sort of has been lost to time is significant. So it's really neat talking about creating a replica. And not only is it going to create a replica that can be used in the community, but then also the knowledge that is gained back to the community as working through the process to create it, realizing, whale baleen was traded and this is what it was used for, and dentalium shells were collected. And so there's a lot of knowledge that is regained back into Indigenous communities, working with them on projects such as a replica of this headdress.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
I want to find out, just kind of, have you been to locations like Egypt or, Peru even, or anywhere that's got these like major archaeological locations, and just kind of walked around and like touched the stones and felt those places yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I love visiting archaeological sites no matter what the country, no matter what the location, because I think in ways we've lost some of those skills. So, being in a place like Egypt or a place like Mexico and visiting these pyramids and being able to, feel the presence of maybe indigenous communities that existed thousands of years ago, it's an incredible feeling, and it's incredible that it's lasted as many years as it has. And I think we need to give a kudos to the knowledge that these indigenous communities had to be able to build these structures that have lasted thousands and thousands of years in the elements, basically unprotected. So I just find it inspiring and incredible every time I visit an archaeological site like that and know that this has existed for thousands of years and it still exists today, and that we need to continue to protect these sites so that 1,000 years from now people can still visit them and still feel inspired when they visit them.
For sure. Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
so much for inviting me. I love talking archaeology and all things museum, so this has been fun, and I'd love to come back another time.
Awesome. Well, I'll have you back anytime.
Cool.
Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you.